Reasoning may be simplistic, but it is based on some common sense. Now, we all remember Vijay Mallya. He isn't a role model, not a businessman with integrity the government and the courts would have us believe. But he did do one thing. When he launched Kingfisher Airlines, he made sure you knew he was the pilot in a sense of speaking. In the aircraft, he would beam his video message thanking us for our business. It may have been a few empty words, but it did for that just one moment make us feel that we had a choice, that it was we who were the king. That illusion went out of the window when the airline sector became what is virtually now a duopoly. Jet Airways, Kingfisher, Go Air, Spice, many more flew into a financial air pocket, if you please. We were left with chiefly two players, cheap and cheerful IndiGo and the tired dowager masquerading as a new bride, Air India. Squeezed into seats with little elbow and knee room, forced to consume overpriced food and confront temperamental airline staff, we were soon reminded that the customer actually isn't king. How far we were being exploited just because we had little choice was confirmed over the last few days, when we were literally grounded with contempt. Cast aside brutishly, lakhs found their lives derailed, missed career-defining job interviews, life-affirming marriages, funerals, crores lost in unfinished business deals. Do you think IndiGo would have taken a chance with us had there been other places customers could have taken their business? I doubt it very much, no. IndiGo was too big to be hurt, and let's be honest, it has pretty much gotten away. Yes, there has been some direct oversight here, there, but the government even handing it an exemption from confirming to new passenger safety regulations. And when regulations are wagged by those, or regulators rather, are wagged by those who they should be regulating, it's never a healthy sign. And therefore, friends, what we know is that the IndiGo crisis has revived fears of monopolies and duopolies across the Indian economy. And those are some graphics from airlines, UPI, and e-commerce. Data does show heavy concentration in a few hands, but experts and regulators say high market share isn't a problem by itself. I have a problem with that assumption. Now, very few want to go back to the days when the MRTP Act that capped market share at 25% was a barrier to growth. But I am certainly convinced that something needs to be done. Has the time come for government to step in? Or are we making the mistake of conflating market share and market power? Let's ask the experts, viewers. I don't pretend to be one. I would love to be corrected, but let's have an honest conversation. Should government draw a line? Gautam Chikarmane, author and VP of ORF, Jay Anand Dehadra, an advocate, Rajiv Mantri, author and investor, Nilesh Shah, MD and CEO, Kotak Mahindra Asset Management. None of these gentlemen require an introduction, let me be honest. All are either involved in corporate affairs or managing the economy or commenting on it in some way or the other. So let's open this up. And I want to first begin with Mr. Nilesh Shah. Mr. Shah, fundamentally, where are we at this point from a larger economic perspective? And is it a good place, especially in sectors where there's a monopoly or there are duopolies and market share is crunched up or eaten up or gobbled up like Pac-Man by one or two players?
There are countries, Rahul, where despite having monopoly and oligopoly, they have been able to leapfrog on growth. For example, 4 chaebols in Korea even today control 44% of GDP. And if we include their vendor ecosystem, the ratio is far, far higher. Point number 2, if you have to worry about monopoly, there are far bigger concerns where someone like WhatsApp has monopoly in our communication. In AI, ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok will have oligopoly. Those are far bigger concerns. But the point remains very valid that market share concentration should not result into consumers being taken for a ride. And we have a perfect solution in front of us. SEBI, TRAI, as a regulator, have done a reasonably good job. So we need to put in place a good regulatory mechanism so that market share concentration gives benefit of economies of scales to consumers and does not result into their abuse, as we have seen in the latest episode.
Opening comments. Let me bring in Mr. Mantri on this. Mr. Mantri, some sectors of the economy and producers involved there obviously provide services that are essential, of essential nature. I mean, typically, one would think that having a monopoly, let's say, in the sugar sector would harm consumers. We can't, do without sugar, one could say, fundamentally, or other essentials. There, should we make a distinction? Should the government step in? What should be done?
Thank you, Rahul. No, I largely agree with Nilesh ji. So I believe that one should focus on reducing barriers to entry, even in essential sectors. So make it easy for businesses to enter that industry. And today, in many industries, actually, the challenge we have is there is kind of implicit or maybe it's not supposed to be a licensed Raj type of approach, but there are kind of implicit and almost invisible type of licenses and barriers which are created, which are preventing competition from arising in certain industries. For essential type of product categories and service categories, government already has certain regulatory mechanisms to control the pricing which are in place. Even in the case of airlines, we saw that they never allowed the prices to go beyond a certain threshold. And when the prices did become extreme because of the disruption of IndiGo, the government immediately imposed those price caps. So I think those mechanisms are there to take care of pricing in such sectors. But what we should really focus on is making sure that barriers to entry don't arise too much, and it remains relatively easier for new firms to enter a particular industry. That is very critical.
No, so we're looking at it exclusively right now, and please correct me if I'm wrong, from the perspective of those that are taking part in the formal economy, not really the consumer, Mr. Mantri. And that's where I feel we should also be focusing. I mean, the consumer may not get much of a say in situations like this. I'm not saying that, market share is a bad thing. Having complete domination is a bad thing, as long as that company is aware that they are there because of consumers and they have actually some sort of bounden responsibility to look after consumer interest.
No question. I think this whole episode has really correctly so battered the IndiGo brand name. I'm sure that there will be a number of consequences for them. I mean, we should wait and see how these things unfold.
But what possibly, consequence-wise, what possibly do you see could be a consequence? I can't tomorrow, for example, decide that, look, I want to take X or Y airline because, as you know, there are entry barriers and they're pretty high in the aviation sector. It's not easy to run airlines. You just can't overnight hire, get new or hire new or lease new aircraft and suddenly expand services. So I really have no choice but to go back to IndiGo and supplicate and hope that they give me 1 extra centimeter more for my knees so that they don't rub up against the person in front of me.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very genuine concern, and it's the nature of some of these industries that once an incumbent becomes very deeply entrenched, it becomes difficult to dislodge them even after such episodes, and that is where regulatory scrutiny and making sure that those who are causing these kind of disruptions and causing such undue damage to consumers who have suffered enormously actually in this whole episode, they face the due consequences.
Yeah, so Mr. Chikkarmane, when a government that is supposed to regulate fails to do so, and we've seen, let's just focus on this airline fiasco in IndiGo. We saw over a period of 2 years, the government could have taken many steps, but it seemed to cut some slack for IndiGo. Now, I'm not getting into the reasons why. There might have been some very practical reasons, but even when the parliamentary panel in August sort of raised a red flag and told the government, look, there is a problem. We are flying into an issue here, big iceberg, you're not seeing it, there's going to be a crash, consumers are going to get burned, safety is going to be compromised, the government does nothing. In that consequence, what does one do?
So I was just talking to one aviation expert, and according to him, and this might be a little rough, the DGCA is one of the prized postings that bureaucrats get. And from what I have seen, those 4 people who have been sacked, none of them are of any consequence as far as the regulatory framework or regulation goes. But they are all lightweights, and whether they are there or not there, it's irrelevant. If we have been asking that the board should resign, the promoter should be in jail and criminal, and all kinds of nasty comments are being thrown at the company, then I wonder what the DGCA is up to. And I think the DGCA itself first needs to be investigated into their links to various companies. I mean, if you go to the DGCA office, you only see extremely large and big and expensive cars outside. You don't see any consumers there. You and I are not going to be standing there in our small cars there. So that's the first thing. I think the government is doing something, but what it is doing is protecting itself and protecting its own people, which is the normal instinct. And I say that this instinct of the 20th century doesn't befit a 21st century economy, which is a $4 trillion economy aiming to be 7, 10, and 30 trillion by the middle of this century. So I think these are outdated. First thing is about that. The regulatory framework has failed. The second thing is that, to me, a company and a board, there are many stakeholders there. There is a board, there are employees, there are investors, there are customers, of course, and the government in a utility like an airline. All these constituencies, all these stakeholders have a part. In this particular case, I feel the responsibility lies with the government, the regulator, and the board. From what I've been hearing, the board seems to have been in tune, and they are trying to follow it up since July. That's what the chairman said today in a video message. But maybe it's too little too late. As far as your other question goes, which is that how come IndiGo is being let go so easily? I remember that early 2010s, I think Kingfisher imploded and everybody was on the back of the promoter. Late 2010s, Jet imploded and everybody was on the back of the promoter again. This time, the 2 people who are not being scrutinized adequately in terms of a trend, I'm not saying you do it, I'm just saying in terms of a trend, are the promoter and the government. So I think a lot of introspection is required. I wonder why heads haven't rolled so far from DGCA management. I'm not talking about small-time operators. Management. What were they doing? Didn't they see it coming? Like you mentioned, there is a parliamentary committee. The issues have been raised earlier. And for every permission that DGCA gives, there has to be an adequate backup in terms of pilots, in terms of fuel. There is a whole big process that goes. And to say that, we will do this, that, and the other without introspecting, I think it's fooling citizens. The airline may have fooled the consumers, but the government is fooling citizens here.
Yeah, so that's why I'm asking. Now, you see, this is precisely the problem, Mr. Chikkarmane, because if the government is reluctant, because perhaps, I don't know, it realizes that if it had stayed the course and put their foot very hard on the jugular of IndiGo, it's the consumer that would have suffered the most. If they had said, no, sorry, we're suspending your license for a week or what have you, or taking your flights and giving them to some other airline, this, that, the other. They could have done all these things, but they didn't. So clearly, we have come to a point where a monopoly or a very big player in the market is dictating terms and is getting away. So should the government have just gone in there and chopped up, I don't know, I'm asking you, chopped up, put a cap, I don't know, broken IndiGo down, what works? How does this work?
Yeah, let me answer this through a little bit of policy history. You mentioned MRTP, Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices
Act, yeah.
The focus of that act was to prevent concentration, if I remember right. I don't know the exact words, but broadly it was prevention of concentration of economic power in the hands of few. Okay, that was the underlying philosophy behind that act. The fact that you were a dominant player means that the act came into existence, and therefore you had to either disinvest or let go, or whatever those provisions in the rules were. When CCI came, Competition Commission of India, it recognized that there could be some things like, let us say, a consumer monopoly. Nilesh just mentioned WhatsApp. It's a consumer monopoly, which so far has not misbehaved, but now we are beginning to get other, and it's dangerous, by the way, 90% market share. And now we're getting Aratai and other Signal and so on. So it's a consumer monopoly. Simply because it has 90% market share doesn't mean you end it, but you need to regulate it. So I think the philosophy for CCI today on monopolies is prohibition of abuse of dominant position. So it's no longer if you are a dominant player, it's not a problem. Abuse of dominance is the problem.
Market
in
power.
Particular case,
Leveraging your market
case,
power.
Yeah, in this case, we need to see if there was an abuse, there was a conscious abuse of dominant power by IndiGo, or was it just some mismanagement or whatever. So these are things this panel cannot decide upon because neither of us has adequate information. But I think the broad guidelines for an investigation ought to be, have they abused consciously their dominant power? If the answer is yes, they will be hauled up, there will be consequences. In the meantime, let us say about 6 months, it's up to the DGCA, the government and the airlines to come together and ensure that consumers do not feel any distress. Otherwise, I think we are looking at, at this moment, I don't see any definitive policy answer to this problem.
Okay, so let me bring in Jayanand Dehadrai. I think what Mr. Chikkarmani is trying to tell us is don't regulate market share. Don't go into the business of trying to cap. Leave that to the free market. But market power, especially if it is being abused, which accrues as a consequence of market share, perhaps you need to regulate that. Do you agree with that? Or is the state again being too intrusive? Who determines what is abuse? Who doesn't? And most importantly, I have to ask you this question because it is something that I think we need to discuss in certain sectors of the economy. For example, there are dominant players in the UPI part of, the payment system. You have Phone Pay or Google Pay, but what you do also have is smaller players. You can pay by cash, of course. There is mobility and portability. You can even switch. So that I don't see in the aviation sector. I don't see in several other sectors. So what do we do there?
Hi Rahul, good evening, and it's always a pleasure to come on your show because you invite such knowledgeable people, and I was listening very carefully to the speakers who addressed their views before me, and I quite agree with that gentleman. And according to me, if you ask me, Rahul, I think IndiGo with its 65% market share, let me make no bones about it, is a de facto monopoly in India today. And according to me, you've also very rightly pointed out that using this dominant sort of power that they have in terms of market share, they have succeeded in arm twisting the government. They've used that basically as leverage. So the idea here is this, that the government comes in with much needed safety norms, the FDTL. We are now essentially following what Europe has done over the last couple of years. We come in, update our norms, and who do we face resistance from the most? IndiGo with its massive market share. So while you have IndiGo, which is essentially getting special treatment from the DGCA, which is something which is very bothersome to me, the other airline operators, Rahul, they've all had to comply. So while your costs are still kept down as IndiGo, the other airlines, they're having to hire more pilots, cabin crew, etc. Their costs will go up. And there are some experts on this panel tonight, and they can correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially, this is, according to me, a fight between a greedy corporate, so you have profitability on the one side, and you have safety on the other side, which is what DGCA is mandated to protect for passengers. And ultimately, IndiGo with its 65% market share, I mean, 6 out of 10 flights, Rahul. So, and movement, mobility within our country now essentially is in the hands of this corporate player. So, I quite agree with you when you look at all of this, that there is a monopoly here at play. Yes, someone else mentioned very rightly that the MRTP initially came in to restrict monopolies, but we realized with time that monopolies per se were not bad. It is only when your dominant position you start abusing, which we have seen now quite literally in the case of IndiGo, is when it becomes an offense. So I think the government desperately needs to step in. They need to wrap IndiGo on the knuckles. I'm sorry to say, but their CEO, this gentleman who's running IndiGo, I think he's done a terrible job, because I was looking into, he's done a terrible job, and I was looking into how the flight schedules are determined, Rahul. It's very interesting. They have to submit their flight schedules to DGCA many months in advance. So they would have known for a fact that, especially during this winter time when families are traveling, when vacation travel is the most, when weddings are happening, they would have known that pressure would be maximum. So they waited, it seems to me, because they sold tickets. They knew that this was going to happen, and yet they sold tickets. They profited from it. And then essentially at the last nth moment, they decided to pull the plug. Yeah. And essentially held a gun to DGCA's head and said, you delay the implementation of these norms qua us for even longer, thereby giving me an unfair advantage over my competitors. So circling back to that first point that was made, I think barriers to entry for airline operators in India need to be relaxed, number one. Number two, ATF, Rahul, is, the pricing for ATF is so ridiculous because every state has its own sort of VAT regime that determines how much tax will be imposed on turbine fuel. So that takes up costs. And there's another factor. The airline operators abroad, I mean, who are into leasing of engines and the aircraft themselves, they charge an additional premium to our airlines here in India because the IBC regime is such in India, Rahul, that if an airline goes under, to reclaim those, the engines or the aircraft is such a nightmare that you build that into the cost of leasing, because the lessor has a nightmare recovering their assets, if the airline goes under, because of our sort of regulatory mechanism that is essentially non-existent. So for all of these factors, I think, and there's one last thing, something very interesting someone told me, this is a bit of a joke. They said, how do you become a millionaire operating an airline? So the joke is that you start as a billionaire and then you start an airline, you become a millionaire. So it is difficult to operate an airline in this country. There's no doubt about it. Okay. And the government is, unfortunately, I think they need to make it easier for them to operate. But at the same time, I think what IndiGo has done to hapless passengers, they deserve to be sued in a class action lawsuit for the damage that they have caused. Well, and countless terrible, I mean, those human stories that are coming out.
You could be the man to lead that. Let me bring in Mr. Nilesh Shah. Yeah. Well, back yourself. Mr. Nilesh Shah, let me ask you this. How do you strike a balance between market power and market share? Now, we've seen the abuse by IndiGo. I'm sorry I'm calling it that because I don't have any other word in my dictionary to define it. It appears like abuse to me. I'm willing to give them, as much leeway as the government is, but that's not in my nature. So I'm going to say that, yes, they abuse their market share and they have overwhelming power. What can the government do?
Well, government has to learn from what they did earlier. There was a time in Indian mutual fund industry where UTI had more market share and power than IndiGo has in airline today. Those were the days where mutual funds portfolios were not disclosed appropriately. The allotment of units happened without any connection to NAV, and eventually it required a bailout from the government. Finally, government created SEBI, though it was created earlier, but government really empowered SEBI. And SEBI as a regulator started co-creating rules and regulations. With the active participation of industry, they created rules, regulations, which people had to follow. They started showing yellow card when people committed small foul. They gave red card when people committed bigger foul. And today we have a vibrant mutual fund industry with more players, and yet top 10 mutual funds have almost 70% plus market share. Government has brought order into mutual fund industry through a regulator like SEBI. The same thing can be done in aviation industry. Please define rules and regulations. Co-create it with the industry participants. Once those borders are established, rules are established, then give yellow card if there are small fouls and give red card if there is bigger foul. I think that's the only way where we could see economies of scale benefiting consumers and consumers not being taken for granted by monopoly or oligopoly player. If there is no regulation, then 10 people can come together through cartelization and yet abuse consumers. What we need is a referee which can enforce the rules and regulations of the game.
Well, that's why, viewers, it's so important that DGCA plays the role that it is supposed to play. And that's why here we've been asking for accountability at the very top of DGCA and maybe even in the Civil Aviation Ministry. I think the time has come when certain questions need to be asked piercingly, because we have now seen when governments pull back or they allow themselves to be dictated to, we suffer. So this is really a governance issue at the end of the day. I'll leave it at this, viewers. Thank you for watching.